Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Wertheimer, and I serve as the Senior Director of Criminal Justice in the City of Philadelphia for Mayor Jim Kenney. And I am delighted to be moderating this really important conversation that I think a lot of jurisdictions have been having in different iterations for several years now. So I want to give everyone the opportunity to introduce themselves, but I'm going to hog the mic for 1 second before I do that and just lay out some context for how I'm thinking about this panel. So to give you some idea, in Philadelphia, there's been incredible progress over the past 4 to 5 years in terms of jail population reduction, largely funded by the MacArthur Foundation, because I know Lori's sitting here. Today was 4,969 people, which is still too many, but a decrease of about 39% from where we were just in 2015. I think we still bear the title of the largest big city's highest incarceration rate, but we're getting closer to not having that be the case. At the same time, however, as of this morning, there had been 249 homicides in Philadelphia this year alone. That's up 2% from where we were this day last year. And by comparison, in 2014, we had only had 183 year-to-date, same day, in that year, and 248 total the entire year. So less that entire year than where we are today. So it's kind of a struggle to figure out how we continue with such important reforms at the same time working to reduce the violence that plagues so many of our communities. I know Philadelphia is not alone in this challenge. So with that, I'd like the panel to introduce themselves.
Sure. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hello. No, thank you. It's great to be here with you this afternoon. So I'm Amanda Alexander, the founder and executive director of the Detroit Justice Center. And I need to say that unfortunately I am breaking a commitment that I always make and try to hold myself to of not being on panels that are not at least 50% women. So I know that those of us who are on the panel were not aware ahead of time of who we were serving on the panel with. But that is just a remark to the organizers to keep that in mind. We are missing the voices of incredible women, black women, scholars, practitioners who would add a lot to this conversation. So need to say that.
So I'm Thomas Apt. I'm the author of a book that was released in June called Bleeding Out, all about how we can reduce urban violence in cities and across the nation. I'm a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, formerly Deputy Secretary of Public Safety here in New York State, former Chief of Staff under the Obama administration to the Office of Justice Programs.
Thank you. My name is Nick Saplina. I am Managing Director for Law and Policy at Everytown for Gun Safety. We're nation's largest gun violence prevention policy organization, primarily work in advocacy contexts at the state or federal, state, and local levels. Very pleased to be here today and be part of this conversation.
Thanks, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone. Grateful to be here. Grateful to have the platform and opportunity to engage in discussion today. Want to recognize the advocates, survivors, and friends that give me this platform to be able to contribute in these spaces where I can. My name is Eric Cumberbatch. I'm the Executive Director of the Office to Prevent Gun Violence here in New York City. And a lot of our work is reframing what justice has historically looked like in New York City. And putting at the core of justice the stability and sense of healing.
Good afternoon. Again, happy to be here, happy to be part of this great panel. My name is Jerry Clayton. I serve as the Sheriff of Washtenaw County, that is Ann Arbor, Michigan. And before I did that, before I got elected, I worked a lot in the area of racial profiling. So I was part of a group that did a number of traffic stop and search studies all across the country and did some ethnic profiling studies in Europe. And also before getting elected, I was part of a couple of different monitoring teams around police practices. And in my role as sheriff, I've tried to lead an organization that is really forward-leaning and trying to put in place policies and practices through the lens of equity and understanding that the community engagement piece is the most important part of what we do in the Sheriff's Office.
Great, thank you. So to start, I want to get a sense of what the landscape looks like both at the national level and at local levels. So Nick, I'm going to start with you. That's all right. As someone who kind of has a foot in both worlds in some sense and is working nationally, can you give us what you see as a divide between the gun violence prevention and criminal justice reform spaces, or if there's not a divide, where you see them coming together?
That is a very good question. So, I do think, I think that there is a divide, and it's easy to see where there is space between or conflict between gun violence policy, gun violence prevention efforts, and criminal justice reform. But I also think that there's a lot of alignment, recent alignment, and some historic alignment, although not in a good way. So taking a little bit of a step back, I think when you talk about gun violence prevention policy, historically you've been talking about criminal justice solutions. You've been talking about penalties. You've been talking about tough on crime efforts at the local level and in a national rhetoric as well. At the altar of criminal justice reform, sort of round one, I, a native New Yorker, was here and part of, the Drop the Rock coalition to reform Rockefeller drug laws. One of the, outputs from that effort was while we started to get things right on nonviolent drug offender programs and deferrals, we really ratcheted up the rhetoric and the penalties for things like gun possession, certainly gun possession in connection. I was just looking back at some of the floor testimony in the New York State Legislature, and the speaker and others who were speaking in favor of criminal justice reform were saying, but we're not talking about guns. I assure you, guns are not going to be part of it. I think that's a long time ago, it feels like now. And I think the criminal justice reform space, as it's grappling with how to define violent and nonviolent offenses, as the gun violence policy movement catches up with criminal justice reformers, we're starting to see that, things like punishment, incarceration, these are not the most effective ways to reduce gun violence, and that has been a learning process. So there's a lot of room and a lot of water under that bridge, but at the same time, I see a lot of positive movement in that direction.
Thank you. Amanda, I'm curious from your perspective, Nick brought up this split between violent and nonviolent offenders as we label them or have labeled them historically. From your work on the ground, how have you seen that affecting the efforts at reform, and how have you seen it coming together?
Sure, thank you. So I would say both are important to focus on, but they achieve different ends. So we work on, kind of both types of cases in Detroit. So we know that our jail in Wayne County, but jails across the country, are full of people there because of crimes of poverty, driving on a suspended license, inability to afford bail. Sheriff Clayton and I serve on a governor's jails task force in Michigan, trying to shrink the jail population in our state. And we just got data back, finding that 2/3 of people who are in jails in Michigan are there on misdemeanor charges. And so, if we want to kind of stem the tide of people who are just rotating through jails for a night or two or for a week, that's going to be about nonviolent, issues. But if we want to actually really reduce the prison population across the U.S., that's going to have to focus on violent offenses. Over half of people who are serving sentences in state jails or prisons are there because of violent crimes. And so we're going to have to address violence in order to really reduce incarceration. And I think that there's some promising work that we're starting to do in Detroit, thinking about how to address violence in a holistic way that's trauma-informed, treating it as a public health issue that I'll speak to later.
Let's come back to that. So Thomas, you just wrote a book about a lot of these efforts, and how does what you see cities doing as the course of business compare to what emerging science and evidence-based practices say we should be doing when it comes to violence reduction?
I think when cities underperform in terms of reducing violence, I think they generally have a sort of quantity over quality emphasis. And I mean that both as a matter of enforcement and also as a matter of prevention. As a matter of enforcement, police are focused on stopping, searching, arresting, and ultimately incarcerating wide groups of people, only a minority, an extreme minority of whom are actually at the highest risk for gun violence. But I think the same is also true on the prevention side. Often we spread our prevention dollars very thin, serving large groups of people, many of whom are in desperate need, but who are not at the highest risk for violence. And so what ends up happening is that while we might be treating those at the highest risk for violence, we're actually not giving them enough assistance, a high enough dosage of treatment, support, and assistance, particularly in relation to trauma. And so I think that what we need to think about in terms of evidence-based approaches to urban violence is quality over quantity.
And Eric, I'm curious if that's what you see in a lot of the neighborhoods in which you work that may be most impacted by violence, over policing, the history of mass incarceration.
Yeah, absolutely. I think before diving into that experience, we have to recognize that these communities that are over-policed or do have issues with violence, this didn't happen by choice and it didn't happen by accident. And this is very intentional and strategically designed by government and state and city actors that have done this to communities of color through actions like redlining, through lack of employment opportunities, through underfunding in schools, through bias in healthcare, and looking at over-punitive justice systems. So when you have all of these things that have an impact on community, then we have adverse outcomes, and now we're talking about individual changes at the person-to-person level, but really what we need to do is recognize what has happened, what policies currently exist from those eras, what procedures still are carried out as main functions of how to engage in communities of color, and start to undo that stress and disorder, and we'll start to see healthy people with healthy outcomes and healthy avenues. So as long as we're in a space where, you know, we're ignoring all of the system efforts that have been put in place to really demoralize and you know, pull the rug out from beneath us, we'll be spinning our wheels at this all the time. So really what we need, or what I would propose, is really looking at system change, sweeping system change, being bold with calling it out, being bold and moving with morals, investing in heart and spirit inside of government, and really changing those pieces so that we're investing in environments, we're investing in healing individuals that have been harmed, healing individuals that have allegedly committed violent acts, but then also healing those spaces, those government and institutional spaces that contribute to a lot of the community's violence and drive community's violence.
Thank you. And Sheriff, how does this compare with the law enforcement perspective when it comes to dealing with gun violence?
So I think for too long, a lot of the police services, law enforcement professionals have eagerly taken on the responsibility that I think isn't a police responsibility. So you know, you call 911, we say we're going to respond, and we have the narrative that we can fix everything. Well, quite frankly, we can't fix everything. And part of what Eric just talked about, there are systemic issues that contribute to violence in communities. that a law enforcement response is not going to fix that. So I think we do have the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time. So if you're in a community that's had the spate of violence right away, what I hear when I go to these meetings of people that are afraid and they're scared. So I tell a story of this happened in our community not too long ago. We had a shooting that happened right outside of a preschool. Community meeting, everybody's afraid. And what I hear, what the community is saying is, we need more police, we need to catch these folks, we need to crack down. This is what people were saying. What I heard is a community of people that are afraid. And if we're not paying attention, our response would be to send more police in there to crack down and cast a wide net and have a negative impact on that community. What they're really asking for is help, and I think we do two things. So we do need to address the specific behavior of those individuals that are perpetrating the violence. We need to address that piece. The other piece is, and I think we can be a part of the larger long-term conversation of how do we shift resources, investment, and focus on the front end to address a lot of the issues that are causing some of this. And I'll add one more piece. Those same individuals that are quote unquote the perpetrators of violence, we have to look at them as first victims before they were perpetrators. There's something going on in that community that contributes to that behavior. And until we focus on that, we're throwing those folks away. Until we recognize that they were victims first, their families are victims, there's family trauma, and unless we do something to break that cycle, we're going to continue to have the same thing going over and over again.
Thank you. So in your introductory answers, you all touched on in a different way a direction that your work is moving in or emerging best practices. And so this is rather open-ended, but I want to go down the line starting with Amanda, probing a little bit more on what you mentioned and talking about what it would look like for that work to continue to be successful and what you see as the biggest obstacles in moving that forward.
So the program that I was talking about is a hospital-based violence intervention program. These happen in cities across the country. We have a particularly special one in Detroit, so I'll talk about the elements that we have there. So it's called Detroit Life is Valuable Every Day. It was started by an ER physician, Dr. Tolu Shinui, a few years back, and he realized that he was patching people up after gunshot wounds, and then having them land back in the ER within 4 or 5 months with re-injury, which is really common. And so he said, unless we are addressing the underlying social determinants of health here and treating this like a public health issue and addressing the underlying trauma, not just of having been shot, but the PTSD of growing up in the neighborhoods that people are growing up in, then we're going to continue to see these cycles of violence and incarceration. And so they started to address those things. So they have violence intervention specialists, peer counselors, folks who are doing mental health support, job placement, GED placement, all sorts of things. And they have served over 100, probably many more, mostly young people, 15 to 34, black men, and not a single one has been re-injured since they have started to do these wraparound, holistic, trauma-informed services. And so Dr. Shinui and I met a couple of years ago, and we realized that we were seeing the same people, but he was seeing them in the ER, and I was seeing them in prison after they had gone on, not having had their trauma addressed, and so kind of having the cycle of violence continue and perpetrating it on other people. And so we decided to start a medical legal partnership. So they have their services that they offer at DLive, and we as attorneys help them remove any legal barriers that they have that would keep them from moving on with their lives. And so some of our clients, one young man, Antoine, woke up after being shot, and he was handcuffed to his hospital bed because he had open warrants for driving on a suspended license. And so too often we see that people are treated as suspects in their own trauma or criminalized in that moment instead of being met with healing. And so we were able to work with Antoine and work with many other folks to go ahead and get all these warrants cleared, get him his driver's license for the first time in his life at 24, so that he can now drive safely without fear of being pulled over. He now has a job, and he and his girlfriend are expecting their first child next month. And so, that's what I see as us being able to really center the needs of people who are in this moment of having survived something deeply traumatic and figuring out what do we need to do to help support their healing. So what we've done over the past year of working with them is listen to how could we further support you, and two things have come up. One is a need for supportive housing. So for many of the young people, they are discharged from the hospital and have nowhere to go. So they might be couch surfing, or they need to keep hustling in the underground economy to make rent, or they have to go back to the apartment complex where they are shot and have their PTSD triggered. And so we're creating supportive housing for them, where they can go and heal for about 8 months as they find a more permanent placement. And that's the type of thing that we would love to see work and work in other cities, and kind of an idea for what we could be reinvesting in that would actually be a health-based solution to addressing violence. The other thing that we're trying to figure out, which I think is actually a bit harder, is there a way that restorative justice could be useful in cases like these? So we know that there's work like Common Justice happening in New York City, but the potential here is to have something that would happen potentially earlier in the process. And so right now we are doing a year of listening to our clients and saying, how could restorative justice be useful to deal with the underlying issues that led to this violent incident? And they are certainly expressing a need for answers in order to heal. One young man who's adjusting to being newly in a wheelchair after being paralyzed, he said, in order to move on, I'm doing a lot with my healing, but I really just need to know why that convenience store owner shot me. And that's the type of thing that the typical criminal legal system will never give him, because people plea out or witnesses don't take the stand. It's not about finding truth in our system. And so the idea here is, could we find some restorative process that would allow for those types of answers and allow us to address the harm without relying on the existing system? And so right now we are just in this period of listening. I think we are not presuming what system actors need to be at the table. I've been asked, are police going to be part of this, prosecutors, or what? And I said, as soon as these young men tell me that a police officer will help with their healing, that's when we might bring them into the conversation. But so far we haven't heard that. But so right now it is really about listening and taking our cues from the young people who are healing from violence and who are closest to that violence. And I think that this is what it means to center the needs of crime victims and survivors. And that's not typically who we have in our mind when we think about who survivors are, but it is these young black men, in their mid-20s who are at the center of this.
So in terms of sort of how I've been looking at this recently through the book, myself and a colleague from Harvard, Chris Winship, and I basically attempted to wrap our arms around all of the most rigorous science concerning violence reduction, over 1,400 individual impact evaluations, and then synthesizing carefully all of the sort of common lessons around what works and what doesn't in terms of keeping people safe, keeping people alive. But then we took it a step further, and I basically went all around the country to basically create a feedback loop between the research and people who had firsthand experience with violence. So talking with them about the science, talking with mothers who had lost children, talking with former shooters, former offenders, talking with street cops, African-American clergy, and others, to basically sort of really try to understand the common ground between what the academy was saying and what the community was saying. And ultimately, there were sort of three common principles that we found about what really works to reduce urban violence in America. The first was focus. Urban violence is driven by a surprisingly small number of people and places, so not surprisingly, you have to focus on those people and places. The second was balance. Somewhat surprisingly, when we looked at all the evidence did not sort of favor sort of soft on crime prevention or quote unquote tough on crime enforcement. there were examples of success all across the spectrum. And in fact, in all of the cities we looked at, no one simply arrested their way out of crime, but no one also just programmed their way out of crime. There was always a carrot and always a stick. And then finally, we had to, the evidence and the moment we're in and the people we talk to, we had to recognize that there is this crisis of confidence in the American criminal justice system today. And ultimately, legitimacy and the legitimacy of the state and of government in these communities, the most impacted communities that are both over-policed and also underprotected. It's extremely important that whatever you do in the name of violence reduction be perceived as legitimate. And in terms of the obstacle, I think one of the hardest things is the politics. The science of violence reduction, the things that we know work, don't really end up in a progressive camp or in a conservative camp. They kind of challenge everybody's priors a little bit. And ultimately, they depend on reconciliation between cops, prosecutors, and the community. And so I think one of the questions and one of the things that I argue in the book is that we have to stop seeing criminal justice reform and public safety as opposites. We need to do them both at the same time, and in fact, they can mutually support each other, and they should mutually support each other.
Yeah, so I think I alluded to in my opening sort of where I see, even at a national level or state policy level, where I see our work going. And I think it starts with a recognition, as has been said, gun violence prevention is not a problem you arrest your way out of. It's not something that jails and prisons can solve, that there's dynamics to the process that are far more complicated and can be you can be far more effective when you resist simplistic responses that are often the first responses you hear from local, state, and federal officials when crime is going up, when violent crime is going up. What I would say is for groups like mine, the direction that I hope to go is to take some of these way upstream preventative policies, do better at connecting why some national level systems in place can actually have benefits, even sometimes in the absence of rigorous science to support it, or with some early, good positive signs that this upstream preventative work can have downstream effects, and then ensuring that upstream work is not doing harm downstream, which I think it needs to be always a touchstone, especially the farther you get away from the local work where the real work on the ground is happening, that you are constantly in a feedback loop with those communities about what actually works. So what does that mean for an advocacy organization that still is most comfortable in legislative arenas, but is increasingly getting involved in non-legislative efforts? My colleague Michael Sean is here, and if I let it just stay with legislative, he wouldn't talk to me anymore. But is to start supporting programs that support local interventions, like hospital-based violence interruption programs, like focused deterrence, like Cure Violence. And so for an organization like mine that operates in 50 state legislatures, supporting bills that are increasing funding, that are directed towards those programs, and making sure they're really directed towards those programs and not just superficially doing so, has become a really new chapter for us. I'd say in the last legislative session, we did more than ever before by a lot. And the last thing I would just say, the obstacles to it are, I think, I see through a political lens, local, national. And I do think the rhetoric coming out of certain very loud voices in Washington just triggers sort of our worst sensibilities, triggers some of our least informed policy options, and ignores the learned experience of so many folks that are on the stage with me about what a cycle of trauma really looks like. It devalues humanity, but it also leads to far less effective policy solutions. Those two things you need to keep those two principles together. And so that's a formidable obstacle in this environment to really usher in an era of trauma-informed, evidence-based solutions to gun violence when you have a backdrop of overly simplistic them versus us and policies that look and feel a lot like that.
Thanks, Nick. It's a great question, and this is like I think everyone on the panel could speak about this forever. There's a lot of politics in how we describe or define success. So me in a mayoral office, oftentimes success is looked at as violent reductions in crimes, or shootings coming down, or homicides coming down. But if you look at a city like New York at its height, where we've seen gun violence come to some of its lowest numbers, homicides come to some of its lowest numbers, it's still the same 5 neighborhoods that are experiencing those numbers of gun violence and homicides. So if we're gonna say success, it's a lot of intricacies that come into there where, it's easy to say on the macro, we're doing this, but if you're living it day to day, how could one say I'm successful? Or how could one say this is successful when a community, the same community, has held this burden for generation after generation? So, it's easy to look at data and say, if we look at New York City since the start of this administration, arrests are down, criminal summons are down, violations are down, shootings are down, homicides are down, and that's successful. But Friday afternoon, I spent a large portion of our evening, and my staff and team are here, purchasing shirts for a young man that was shot and killed for his memorial for that weekend. So when we talk about success, there's those large numbers, but then there's the people that are really living this day to day. And I've never went to a mother or a father of a loved one and said, hey, we're successful, that has lost a loved one. I just think there's a huge disconnect there, and there's a lot of just challenges in communicating what success looks like. And for people that have been experiencing, blight and just distress in their neighborhoods, telling them that we're on the right path or we're moving towards that brings no consolation. It's no solace there. There's no healing in saying we're moving in the right direction. I think we're smart enough, and we need bold people that could step forward and move off of the track that's we will eventually get there and just do it and get us there. And doing it and getting us there really involves the community, right? So a lot of what we're doing is changing what our positioning of government has looked like. I've never thought I would be an executive director anywhere. Never thought I would be an executive director in a mayoral office. That just wasn't who I am. It wasn't part of my trajectory. Definitely wasn't part of what I was exposed to in coming up. But in doing that, really what we wanted to do was just break down the door and put groups of people that really represent the communities that we focus on. These people are late. Really look at how we can be the change from within government, and really impact systems. So our main approach is really how do we redefine justice in New York City, and at the forefront, it's from us, by us. We're the ones that are infusing healing into every single touch point and practice that we have, whether that's on the policy level, whether that's in program space, whether that's with agencies. I also want to touch on what we know. So we know what doesn't work, which is more jail, more incarceration. We've been there, we've done that. And I think, it may have been Thomas, well, these are all bright panelists, but it's been mentioned, where does this fall? Is this a more liberal? Is it a more conservative piece? And I argue it's a fiscal piece. And if we're really serious about doing this, having the political will to value individuals and to value their life. And when you value your life, then the budget should reflect that for a city. And whether it's downstream as far as these interventions that are taking place in hospitals and taking place in street outreach work and other spaces, but there's a whole other spectrum where we need to infuse ourselves if we're talking about violence reduction. This is not when a person gets shot that we're concerned about violence reduction. We already know the neighborhoods, we know the individuals, we know all of the risk factors and the indicators, but yet we wait for the person to be engaged in violence and or experience one of the most horrific things that can ultimately happen to them. So we know what doesn't work. What we know that does work is very hyper-localized engagement. And that engagement is looking at specific areas, and like I started with, it's the same areas. It's the same areas across this city. So, there were 3 precincts in New York City that had more shootings than what New York experiences now in a total year. Just 3 precincts. Today, New York City has low rates of guns, but it's still those 3 precincts that are experiencing the greatest amount of shooting incidents, the greatest amount of homicides. So really looking at hyper-localized areas, and then with a very small number of individuals that are entrenched in a cycle of violence, and as victim and perpetrator, the two are the same. So really working with that population. Obstacles, I believe the biggest obstacle is government. And I say that because the more touch you have with government, the more touch you have with agencies, and I facetiously say this to people on the street when we engage. I say, the worse off you are. And when people say, Eric, I haven't seen you in so long, I said, then your neighborhood's doing good. Because it's this sense of paternalism where we can't recognize the individuals that are closest to the issue to be the ones that have the solutions, and give them a platform, equip them with tools, resources, and allow them to thrive through their vision. It's their community. Before Jerry's gonna tap me like, give me the mic, Eric. But before I even, as I continue, I just want to recognize like the individuals that bring so much strength to this healing equation. And oftentimes, we turn a back to them. And our formerly incarcerated brothers and sisters that have so much to lend in this space and so much to give in this space. And I'm grateful for brothers like Eddie and Divine that are in the room today that are pushing this agenda forward, because their expertise, their knowledge, their life experience is invaluable in this process. And what we want to do is lift those types of brothers and sisters up to be at the forefront of creating what success ultimately will be in community, and how do we break down the barriers that they've experienced.
So how do I follow that? So real quick, just remind me where.
Sure. I think what I started with was you may have touched on what you see as national trend or best practice, or where you're going with your work, and what success would look like for that to continue, and what challenges or obstacles you're experiencing.
Got it. So in our profession, and this was said earlier today by one of the panelists, so we're talking the police services profession, leadership matters. So in communities, whatever police agency you see where there's actually some reform, where there's actually a change in policy and practice and culture within that agency, where there are outcomes that resonate with the community, it's because there's been some continuity of leadership in that organization, and there's leaders, couple things, with vision, with an understanding that you don't leverage the authority that the people gave you to hold the people down. You leverage the authority that the people gave you to engage with them and create the kind of community that you both can be proud of. I think that's extremely rare. The obstacle in our profession, and I'll harken back to the days I was doing the work, Ron Davis in the back, we were doing the work on racial profiling, bias-based policing. There is no argument that it exists in our profession. Not every police officer, not every agency, but look, police agencies are made up of people. People have biases. Those biases, if left unchecked, unchallenged, manifest themselves in decisions and actions that impact what we value most, right? Our freedom and sometimes our lives. There is not a concerted effort in our profession to challenge those old basic assumptions, to challenge what our role is, to challenge the practices that we have in place, and to acknowledge the disparate impact that it's had on communities throughout the history of our profession. There are few, but I would argue they're more the unicorn than the consistent practitioner. So when we think about what our obstacles are, listen, I think when we think about violence and gun violence, when we're talking about criminal justice reform, my belief, through the lens of an African-American man that's been on this planet for 55 years and a police services professional that's been doing it for 35 years, is we don't achieve what we want to achieve without having police in the room, without having them as part of this equation. The challenge for us is to engage and make sure that we have the right leaders with the right vision and the courage to articulate that vision in the room. And that starts and ends with the people. So as a sheriff, I'm elected. I represent the people. If I don't represent their values, then they should boot me out. For chiefs, they work for elected officials. The people have the opportunity to exercise their voice to talk about the leaders that you want in that police department, to talk about the outcomes that you want from that relationship with the police department. I think the obstacles are us as a people understanding how we wield the tremendous influence that we have and how we challenge those people that sit in positions like myself that don't represent our values, and we get them out and replace them with people that will. We talked about this is about politics. It is about politics. It is about politics, and it's about us being strategic. And it's about us pointing to examples where that leadership actually does result in fundamental change. So I'll end it there, because tomorrow I'm going to talk a little bit about how you lead cultural change in an organization. And I'm going to start it by talking about a group that I have that I'll just mention really, really quick about a success. So we have a group that's called Sure Moms, Sisters United, Resilient, and Empowered. And that group got formed because of the violence and the trauma that was going on in our communities. And we talked to folks in the community, we got educated by them, and what we found is a lot of the juvenile justice informed young people, they would go through the process and they'd come out positioned to be successful. Where were they going back to? Homes and families that were in trauma. And we found out it was mostly moms and grandmas that were in trauma. And there was nobody paying attention to them. Nobody giving them voice, nobody engaging them and helping them navigate their own trauma. So Sure Moms is that group that we started as a sheriff's office to work with the community, work with those moms to help them navigate their trauma. So when their kids came back, they were better prepared to help them navigate their own. So it's an example, I think, of an organization with leadership that understands what their role is, where we can actually make impact. We can actually make change. So I just implore. Uh-oh. I'm done.
If only Siri could solve the intersection
Solve our
of
problem.
criminal justice.
And she says she has no answer, so we'll go to the next person.
We'll ask Alexa next.
So I think we hit on a lot of important themes and topics here, and hopefully we can come back to them. But I want to throw a question out there that touches on a lot of the things that you talked about, but is something that as a system actor, I've grappled with. And we've talked a lot about the need for a balance between enforcement and support and resources. And some of the interventions, it's easy to rely on infusing more social services, assuming they actually exist. But when we talk about something like focused deterrence, that relies on traditional enforcement techniques like high cash bails or threats of incarceration or supervision, at the same time that we're talking about trying to eliminate cash bail and reduce supervision, either from a policy and moral perspective or purely from an operational perspective, how do we square that? Open to anyone.
Well, I guess, so I guess I'll take a first crack at that since in my book I talk a lot about focused deterrence. Focused deterrence does have the strongest body of evidence of any single anti-violence intervention. It doesn't mean it's always a panacea. It doesn't mean it should be done in every city. But if you're looking for the program with the strongest evidence, it's focused deterrence. Why is that? Because when it's done right, it represents these three elements that I talked about. It's focused. It does use law enforcement, not just law enforcement, but also services and the voice of community. But it's engaged only with the highest risk individuals and groups and not on classes of people generally. Second, it's balanced. It makes two sets of promises. If you keep shooting, we're going to stop you. But if you stop shooting, we're going to help you. And good programs stay true to their word on both. And in fact, one of the things that we're seeing is in the later iterations of focused deterrence, like the most recent, very successful one in Oakland, they actually have quite high quality services associated with them. And then lastly, fairness. In these programs, it's a partnership. It's not just the police, it's the community, it's mothers who have lost children saying, look, what you're doing has to stop, but we want you back. We want you to be part of this community, and we are offering you a choice. And I think that that fairness, a lot of the emerging research says, is part of the reason that it's successful. But I think that one of the things that we have to note is that, in order to be successful on this, we have to recognize that we are interested in reducing racial disparities throughout the system. But there are massive racial disparities in violent victimization as well. And communities are, as the sheriff said, are in fear, and people are losing their lives, friends, and family members. And we have to be able to do two things at once. We have to recognize that this system is failing these poor communities of color in two ways. It is overburdening them, as I said, but it is also underprotecting them. Look at the homicide clearance rates in Chicago, in Baltimore, and in other high violent cities. Where's the justice for those people? Don't they deserve the same kind of justice as everyone else? And I think we just need to understand that if we're really trying to serve these communities, if we're really serious about that, we have to embrace the complexity of that.
I think Amanda, did you?
Sure.
Gotta make sure you have the mic. The way you opened up, we have to have equality on this panel.
On this point, I think what is concerning to me about the idea of law enforcement or the existing folks who have kind of had the monopoly on the conversation on safety getting to play a key role is that, if we pan out and we look at what contributes to well-being, health, all of this in these communities, it's all of these other areas that have been divested from so that we could maintain investment in law enforcement and criminal justice. And so I think it's really stark in Detroit. If you see the ways that for many years we had this extreme retraction of the welfare state. So, parks were not being maintained, sidewalks weren't being maintained, streetlights weren't on, schools were shutting down, water was being shut off, all these other things. And yet, if police wanted to find you to serve you a warrant, or if CPS wanted to come to your home and take your kids away and charge you with neglect because you had no running water, those things would happen. And so I think what we ultimately need to do is keep the bigger picture in mind of all of the ways that these communities need resources that actually contribute to questions of violence, education, healthcare, and look at where all that money is tied up. It's in our criminal justice system. And so thinking about the longer term play of ultimately divesting from these systems so that we can reinvest in those other things. And my fear would be that if we keep trying to ram social work and other social services through law enforcement or through the criminal justice system, then it ultimately ends up kind of bloating the one system that has always had the resources. So that's my concern about some of this conversation.
So I agree with Amanda 100%. I think, and again, but that's more of a societal, cultural issue, that we have to change our basic assumptions around what makes us safe. I mean, I think we even have to challenge ourselves around the definition of public safety. We think public safety, we think police and fire. It's more than that. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That contributes to public safety. Do I have shelter? Do I have safe water to drink? All those things I think contribute. So I'm right there. There needs to be a change and a reinvestment of those dollars. But here's what you'll hear, and I'm right there with you. But from a societal standpoint, then don't hold the police accountable for some of those issues when we reinvest those dollars. So again, as the sheriff, I would say, look, you want to take 10% out of my budget? Take 10%, 15% out of that budget and redirect it on the front end, which is where it should be. On those services that we know if we don't pay attention, we know this, education, housing, all those things. And we've also said as a police leader, and Ron has said this too, as a sheriff, I don't take credit when crime rates go down. I don't. I'm a fool if I do. Because I know I only have just a small footprint on that, imprint on that. Because when it goes up, where y'all gonna look? Same thing for running the jail. I don't take credit when recidivism goes down. Because if it peaks back up, I know there are too many contributing factors. So here's my point. I'm right there with you. But we have to know from a societal standpoint, we didn't get here overnight. So as we start doing that reinvestment, let's be patient and understand it's going to take a long time for that to shift. We shouldn't be afraid of it, and I'm not saying we don't do it because of it, but we should have an honest conversation about what that looks like and what it means, because if you go back and shift it, and then you hold the chief accountable for crime rates, what is he or she going to do? They're going to do what they think they're supposed to do to get crime down, oversaturate neighborhoods. So I just think we need to have an honest conversation about what it all entails and the time it's going to take to really shift that. And let's make sure from a societal standpoint, we change our basic assumptions about how we make ourselves safer.
Thanks, Jerry. Jerry's my brother. We were actually in Montana together, watching out for bears, making sure that they didn't get us. But this is where I have to disagree with Jerry just a little bit. You gotta love them and then knock them down. I don't think it has to be one versus the other, right? So when you have local law enforcement and they have their budget, and that's great, that's fine. But when we see crime rates falling, there's a cost to those crime rates falling, and those are savings to the city. So when we talk about what do we do as crime drops, so fewer homicides means fewer admits to a trauma center, fewer detective hours in trying to prosecute a crime, fewer prosecutors, fewer beds in jail. So there's a huge savings that happens as crime falls. But there has to be the political will to reinvest that money on more of the front end and not look at those savings as, okay, we just keep increasing one's budget. So it doesn't have to be taking away from another agency, and it doesn't have to be one versus the other, but it's how do we redirect savings that cities are experiencing to the most appropriate resources. And we know them. It's just having the political will and the moral compass to do it. To the original question, which I believe, I write everything down, which was about bail and supervision, right? We know that bail punishes the poor. So when we talk about cash bail as a means of almost keeping us safe, what we're really saying and doing is the poor people are the ones that cause the problem, and we need to keep them in jail as much as possible, basically for being poor. And everybody on the panel has spelled out all of the levels of distress disorder in community. And in terms of supervision, we have the ability to redefine what supervision looks like. Supervision does not have to be what it has historically been. One of the things that we're doing here, our supervision, our biggest program out of the Office to Prevent Gun Violence that we consider supervision is an employment program where we actually hire young people. We utilize the community to identify those young people that everyone in the community has their eyes on and thinks this young person can be harmed and/or harm someone else. And we employ that young person, put them around people that can model positive behaviors, pro-social behaviors, engage them around joining our network. And we've done that with over 400 young people in New York City. So it's how do we have the boldness and the courage to step out of the status quo and do things differently. But all of it is doable. It just takes the mind, takes the heart and spirit, but it's all doable.
Thank you. I could ask a lot more questions, but I'm getting the signal to go to Q&A so that you have a chance to ask questions. So let's see, we'll start over here. And
So I just kind of want to redirect. I think what Julie was talking about was focus deterrence, right? And I wanted to see if you could elaborate more on like your thoughts behind focus deterrence. And I think just generally, like Amanda, you spoke to like long term, right? So I see focus deterrence as, solving the problem right away, like getting quick results, right? Which is what law enforcement focuses on. So my question is, where can we have people like Amanda come together with people like Jerry to come up with a solution that gives you results of focus deterrence without taking the resources away from what a long-term solution needs to be, right? Because you focus on focus deterrence with people that are committing the crimes in neighborhoods that are happening, but then what about the next batch of people that come next, right? You did focus deterrence on this group, but then there's a whole other batch of kids, young men, coming in after them. But what Amanda's focusing on is long-term to make sure that those kids aren't coming back into that room to face, the consequences of focus deterrence. So. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about that. Focus deterrence first.
okay, let's answer that one first.
I think the question is posed to me. Do just answer? All right. So I would say I agree with you 100%, and what we call it is a farm, right? So you have one crop, you wait for the harvest, you extract that harvest, and then you wait for the next crop to grow, and you'll do the same thing. And it's repeated and repeated again. I believe there is strong data that supports the success of focused deterrence, and it uses a lot of the principles of what we know that works, which is hyper-localized area, hyper-localized people. I think where there's room for synergy is around culture and norm shifting and change. So if it's solely about, I'm engaging these individuals around a gun violence pattern and not looking at how do I change the culture, how do I help heal environment, how do I infuse healing amongst different networks, then we're always going to be in this same cycle. So I think there is a synergy there. There's differences in how we approach our communities. And law enforcement doesn't always have to be the first touch point and/or shouldn't be the leading or only touch point. And we have so many other resources in community, if backed and bolstered, could easily have the exact same approach from a very different lens and a very different feel that comes along with it. So, I think the two can be bridged, but I don't necessarily know why you would want to bridge the two. And I think, standing up individuals and community organizations to finally be allowed to organize in their communities and have ownership of their communities and hold one another accountable in their communities, and then be properly and adequately resourced by government to do that, I don't think there's a need for more police to do these things. So we can look here, we head up the block a little more in the Upper West Side, and we're not saying who's rounding up individuals or who's we're not having that conversation here, because if you go outside, you have a neighborhood that has every resource that the city could pour into keeping a community vibrant and thriving. And then you go to another neighborhood, and you know, I live in Bed-Stuy, which is the greatest neighborhood in New York City, by the way. Few people from Bed-Stuy. But if you look at certain pockets, and you could see stark differences, and then what you have are different outcomes. So, you know, I'm really about let's build the community, and when you have a healthy community, then you have healthy people, healthy community, healthy people, you have healthy outcomes.
I know that you didn't ask me, so I'm going to be very, very brief. I would just point out in absolute terms, focused deterrence is very inexpensive. And so this idea that you do either focused deterrence or you do your broader economic and social justice work is a false choice. We can save lives right now and advocate for longer term things. That no one wants to live in a community that is unequal and poor but safe. But I would just point out, it's not one or the other.
All right. It seems to me that this panel and others have given up on the real causes of gun violence, and that is access to guns. There are more guns in this country than people, and I don't hear anyone speaking, any of the panel speaking to that. I wish you would.
I will definitely speak to that. And I really appreciate you saying that. Look, I mean, the fact of the matter is that there are so many on-the-ground programs that are so effective at reducing gun violence that remove us entirely from this national debate. We don't have to say the word gun. We can talk about violence, but the fact is, you are right. I very much believe, to give it a technical term, in a supply-side theory of gun violence reduction. We have too many guns. They are too easy to access. And I actually think as we understand better, and we've chronically underinvested in understanding this problem, and I think I know the reasons why, the way guns move from legal, recreational, or protection-based commodities and are poured into communities that already have the structural disadvantages, that are prone to misuse and illegally own these weapons, that is a conversation and that is a connection between the upstream and the downstream that I certainly believe it's my job to make those connections. Look, we can have a conversation about who, and I think, again, all the good science says at the local level, we really are talking about a very small group of people. But I think nobody would take offense to the idea that if you were giving out guns on every street corner in New York City, you would not be able to succeed in any local gun program. Access to firearms, seeing a firearm as a way to solve a problem and being able to get it is a critical condition, precedent before you can take these other interventions. So that is the focus of I appreciate you teeing that one up for me. And that is the principal focus of our work at the national and state levels. I think that there are ways that you can, channel policy so that it is tailored, so that those, so that you don't need to get rid of all to really dramatically improve public safety. But until you're willing to have that conversation upstream, I think downstream will always have a supply problem, not just a demand problem.
Hi, thanks so much for this panel. Thomas, I read your book in 2 days, and I assure everyone here I'm not a plant for the publisher. It was fantastic. My question for you, Thomas, is it seems like we were having this discussion of the choice between investing in law enforcement, policing, focused deterrence, and these more holistic long-term solutions. And I wonder if that is a unique aspect of the United States, because in most of Europe, there are national funding streams for policing, and we don't have that in the United States. So any thoughts on whether addressing that issue can maybe help cities and counties avoid that false dichotomy?
Well, I think I'm not so sure this sort of battle over budgets is a constructive way to address this issue. In fact, in Los Angeles, which experienced a massive reduction in crime over the past 2 decades, you had Chief Beck, who would go to the city council and lobby on behalf of community-based organizations, street outreach workers, saying, don't you dare cut the funding of my street outreach workers, and vice versa. And what we really need to see is public health advocating for public safety and vice versa. I think we need to have a sense of, we're either going to do this together or not at all. And I would just point out that the amount of dollars it takes, because this problem is so concentrated, is de minimis in terms of a city budget or in terms of the federal budget. It's a fraction of a percent. And so you don't need to raid someone else's budget to get the money to do this well. You just need a little bit of courage and a little bit of vision in order to do it. And so I would say that actually the money is there if we will only sort of fund what works in terms of evidence and then socialize what works in terms of really engaging with the community.
Hi, Nick. I wanted to follow up on what Eric said about the need for political will for this reinvestment. And since we have a few New Yorkers on stage, maybe I'll use that as an example of, I've been very impressed with some of the outcomes of the Center for Court Innovations, kind of focused deterrence, cure violence hybrid, and it's been very successful and very cost effective in places like Crown Heights, but I haven't seen it haven't seen expanded places where white people aren't trying to gentrify and move in. And there's a $6 billion NYPD budget, and these programs are very inexpensive. How do we shift this to where, let's spend the dollars and the political capital in places where we're not just trying to make it safe for white people?
Safe for white people. So I don't know of a ceasefire cure violence hybrid that's taken place out of Crown Heights. I know the Crown Heights SOS team operates under the New York City Crisis Management System, cure violence at its core, and then several supportive social services, job training, job set-asides, legal aid, therapeutic and professional mental health, and hospital response. So there's not the mesh, but the 77 precinct in Crown Heights may also have a focused deterrence program that's operating, but the two are separate and apart. In New York City, the crisis management system is actually in 22 different neighborhoods across the city, in all 5 boroughs. And the way that those locations are selected, it's really based on the number of shooting incidents, looking at where is the greatest concentration of shootings happening, and then really drilling down to that local level to have the biggest saturation of services, and then utilizing community members to be the ones that are engaging with those who are most likely to be harmed or harm someone else. You're spot on in terms of the budget, $6 million. Our budget for crisis management system in New York is about $36 million, which is probably one of the largest budgets to do this types of programming in the country. But again, it shows that huge disparity. And it's part of the reason that we're looking at, really how do we reinvest based off of the savings that we're seeing. So we've had tremendous success with crisis management system, and we want to reinvest those savings where we don't have as many people being harmed, we don't have as many people being arrested and/or detained, and there's a huge savings in that. The other piece is, government shouldn't be the only sole source of funding. And we have all of these, Wall Street Financial District groups where our annual budget of $36 million might not even be what they're going to give out in bonuses in December. So, really making the connection that one person harmed, one person shot affects us all, and driving that message home, and really people having the moral compass to invest with their heart as New Yorkers.
Hi. My name is Aisha Ogilvy. I'm a member of Community Board 12 of Manhattan, which is an appointed position here in New York City, for those of you that are not aware. I'm also recently elected to County Committee, which is with the Democratic Party, so I believe in service to the community. I believe in community members stepping up, and as someone on the panel said, being bold about being a part of the solution. However, I have found it incredibly difficult to speak to the need for political will for things that are already in place and that are supposed to be. An example of this is in my community, there is a building called the Fort Washington Armory that is supposed to be in service to the community. It's city-owned. It's one of the biggest facilities in our district. It's 2 acres big. One organization has been allowed to take it over for their own personal benefit. The top 5 people are paying themselves $1 million, while mostly excluding the children and people of color that are the predominant people in that district. The mayor has been a part of that discussion since 5 years ago. I've dealt with bullying because of my advocacy, dealing with that issue. It's been in the media. I just don't even know what to do anymore. And for me, it is about the impact on our community. It's about preventing violence, because by the time someone gets killed, we've already missed the mark. How do we ensure that the resources that already exist are used to the benefit of our community? Something that has happened in that space is that a man was allowed to have an apartment in this city building for 7 years, where he would fly in 5 months out of the year just to be a part of the track program that exists there and live there, when that could have been providing 36,000 hours of services for the community in any regard, whether it be youth services, services for our elders, etc. It's too hard to fight sometimes. And the fight often is something that shouldn't be a fight, because it's policy that's already been instated. How do we ensure that we live up to what we already decided is good for our communities?
So obviously, I'll leave it to one of the New Yorkers to talk about the specifics of that scenario, because I come from Detroit and I don't know it. But on the broader principle, I would say I'm familiar with these types of fights. I think it speaks to some deeper issues, again, not about the specifics of the situation, but resources flow to resources. So to put a finer point on what I was talking about, in terms of needing to divest and reinvest, these are not kind of pie in the sky, large scale, long-term budget decisions. They are very specific, ongoing decisions that are made all the time. And so, for example, in Michigan, we had some proposed bail reform legislation. And one of the aspects of this proposed legislation that has not passed yet, fortunately, is that any cost savings that counties experience from implementing bail reform to be reinvested in police and sheriff's budgets. And that is where it would, it becomes very difficult to make sure that people are saying, no, we have always been invested in. And if we're going to redirect things, it needs to go towards community-based programs and other solutions that haven't been resourced. And so they are micro decisions. It's, powerful people who already have resources saying, no, actually we don't need that. It should be going into other things. And so I just wanted to make sure that people know that it's not an abstract question. It's policy decisions that are made all the time, and that we can reevaluate all the time.
I want to, one, I commend you for your fight as an activist. I'm not familiar enough with the situation or scenario to answer that from the stage, some of those intricacies that you brought out. But I am an advocate of all of the city's activists, so I am willing to exchange contact info and see how I could best support and get you some of the answers that you're looking for and or get you to the right people so that you can drive that conversation with our help and or with the coalition that you've already formed in the district. So I do want to offer you that.
Let's go. I think there's one question last question there.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Divine Pryor, and I am a person who was formerly incarcerated. The reason why I start out by saying that is because too often, we have a particular view in our mind of what a formerly incarcerated person is or is not. I commend the panel. I think it was an extraordinary conversation. It was very informative, but I know that there's something that we've been tiptoeing around that we don't really want to address. So I figure I'll be the one to do it. And that is the deserving and the undeserving. Because these communities right now that are being hard hit with gun violence are the same communities that have been historically neglected. It doesn't make a difference whether it's New York, Detroit, Mississippi, pick whatever state you want. It's the same communities. They have the highest rates of unemployment, failing public school systems, substandard housing, poor quality health care, and these are the feeders to the prison system, the prison industrial complex. So we already know this already. I mean, we don't need to belabor the point. We know what's happening and what communities they're happening in. The question that I want to ask is, why are we beating around the bush? Because I know that if gun violence was happening at this rate in white communities, there'd be so much money in there, you'd be swimming in money. There'd be so much attention, there'd be so much effort, there'd be so much policy, but because these are communities of folks who are less deserving, we continue to see this cycle of violence and this cycle of recidivism. I mean, it's insane that the recidivism rate across the nation has been at close to 70% for the past 4 or 5 decades. 70%. That means 7 out of 10 people that come out go back. A third go back within 3 years. Y'all know the research. Why are we allowing this recidivism rate to happen? Is it because these communities are expendable? Is it because these people fall within the percentage of acceptable loss? I mean, when are we going to have the real discussion about racism and about entitlement and about why these black, brown, and poor communities are continuing to be neglected and why we're not paying the attention that we should be paying? Now, that's probably unfair for me to raise this at the end of the panel. I understand that. I started out by saying you did a remarkable job. But until we get honest, until we're really ready and able to have an honest discussion, because this is what's happening with this sister here. I'm only slightly familiar with what's happening with that situation, but that situation is happening all over the country. That's not just there. I mean, I could give you dozens. We could be here until tomorrow this time, and I could run a litany of cases. We're tired of having the same conversation. We know what the problem is. We know what works, and we know what doesn't work. So when do we begin to start focusing on what works and moving away from what we know doesn't work? I know that's a long question, but...
So I'm going to use your question, which is an excellent question, to tee up asking the panelists to give us some closing thoughts while trying to answer, I think, what we've been trying to get at the entire time. So.
No, I really appreciate the question, the way that you framed it. I think it's absolutely right that this is happening in communities because of racism that have been abandoned in so many ways. And so one of the heartening kind of solutions that I see that's come out in the last 10 years or so, I like to talk about this organizing that happened on the south side of Chicago by a group of young people, fearless leading by the youth. And they fought and won a battle over many years for a multi-million-dollar trauma center from the University of Chicago. And this was a response to violence in their neighborhood, where they realized that people were being shot and they were dying on the way to the nearest trauma center because there wasn't a trauma center in the neighborhood that could deal with this. And so what they realized was they were effectively being abandoned to die, and that the underlying problem here was a lack of adequate health care. And so I think it's important to just follow the lead of young people like this who could have followed a punitive course. You know, there's always a punitive answer. They could have called for harsher gun laws. They could have called for more police. And instead they called for care. You know, and so, and they won it by occupying and, you know, taking arrests and all of this. They looked around and thought, what was the wealthy institution in our neighborhood that could give it to us? And it was the University of Chicago. And so I think it's a beautiful way of taking something that, you know, is stemming out of tragedy and underlying racist abandonment and using that moment to redirect towards not punishment, but care and the resources that communities actually need.
I guess I would just sort of conclude with a request. We've talked a lot about injustice, and I would just note that murder is perhaps the greatest injustice that one person can do to another. And in fact, there is a massive racial disparity in the United States about who gets murdered and who gets justice when people are murdered. And so what I would just ask this audience, and I ask all around the country, is for those of us who are deeply committed progressives, and this is largely a progressive conference and a progressive audience, please keep in mind that as we have our long-term struggles to remedy inequality, to remedy poverty, to remedy structural racism, to remedy lack of opportunity, that there are proven strategies available now to save the lives of poor black and brown people. Eddie Bocanegra is working on Ready Chicago, a CBT, transitional employment program. We have lots of success with street outreach, and even, yes, focused deterrence, a program that is pioneered by David Kennedy and the National Network for Safe Communities. Please don't let the politics obstruct you from those life-saving programs.
I just saw a 5-minute sign, and I want to let you guys answer it. Jerry, you also haven't spoken in a while, so I'll pass the mic. Oh, you have mics.
Thanks, Nick. So I want to take a stab at Dr. Divine Pryor's contribution. You're absolutely spot on. I don't think anyone has danced around race being at the core of all of this. I think it's been explicitly expressed that this has intentionally and strategically been done to black and brown communities. And what we're seeing today and having conversation today is the signs and symptoms of all of those adverse impacts. So we are talking about it, but talking about it, then we put it into action. And one of the things that we've done in the Office to Prevent Gun Violence is recently released our theory of change, which is based on anti-racist racial equity framework. And at the core of doing that is bringing people like yourself into a space where you are actually our lead and partner in this co-production of safety from that lens. And we're happy that we're actually contracting with you to do just that with our partners across the city under your leadership. So it is with that lens and recognition. And as we engage from a mayoral office, it doesn't just stay in our office. Our engagement is really to change, to transform government as it's historically been, and then tap into those city agencies and really look to embed these approaches and really get them to embrace our people that have been left behind. I do want to offer, and thank you, Divine, I do want to offer that some of the most violent crimes were a point in time, a matter of seconds. And there's a lot of factors behind that, and influences and you know, needs, wants, and periods of time. But I do caution great injustice, I believe that, but caution describing an individual by possibly the most horrific act that they've committed in their lives. And defining that person and casting that on them forever is, in my heart, the biggest injustice. And that there's individuals who have been part of violent activity, violent crime, for a number of reasons, but people change, people heal, people have reformed themselves, and some of our greatest reformers in the space are those individuals. So I just want to recognize that and not cast the light that people are irredeemable. I believe in people.
So I don't have much more to add, except for the fact that, so I think there was an acknowledgement about race. I think I tried to acknowledge it in the policing world that there's a history in this profession that you cannot debate around racism and the impact of that on people of color, poor people. And I think that has to be acknowledged. And inside the profession, we have to acknowledge it, and we have to try to filter all of our decisions, our policies, and our practices through that lens. And I don't think we can do it on our own. That we need to engage people in the community to help us see that. So I don't care what you do, you have blind spots. And we know in our profession we have blind spots. And the only way to illuminate that is to engage with people outside of your profession to have a conversation about what is the outcome of our work, how does it add value in the community? So a lot of the discussions that I have in our community is just that question. So when we do community engagement, it's not about us talking to folks, it's about us shutting up and listening. So I think that's part of it, the acknowledgement of the profession, the impact, and then a commitment to how do we make things better. And I think that's an important part of it.
Well, I want to give our panel a big round of applause for a great conversation today.